Welcome to Maintainable, the podcast where we explore the art and sometimes the mess of software that lasts. I'm your host, Robby Russell. Today I'm joined by Kent Beck. That's right, the pioneering voice in software design and one of the original signatories of the Agile Manifesto. He's known for extreme programming, test-driven development, and most recently his book, Tidy First, which challenges how we think about changing code. Kent joins us from sunny California. Kent Beck, welcome to Maintainable.
Thank you so much, Robby. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Likewise. All right, Kent, so what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
Well, there's this interesting tension. So resolving that tension is the job of especially senior developers, because you've lived through the results of not resolving that tension, where the Tidy First book that I published 2 years ago talks about software development value coming in two forms: the features that you have and the options that you have for future features. And that's the essential tension. And part of the problem is that progress along features is legible in the seeing like a state sense. It's easy to count. It's users notice it, the salespeople notice it. But progress on the options front is harder to keep track of. And when you say maintainable, that's what I'm thinking. It's about some combination of the cost of ownership of the software as it currently stands and the possibilities for future development.
From your perspective, been around for a number of decades now, how would you describe cost of ownership? Are we talking just like software hours, development, the cost of just having your team? Tell us more about that.
Well, it's down to dollars if we're going to talk about sustainable development and development that provides value to everybody who's involved. And yeah, that can be the cost of spinning up a new person on the team. It can be the cost of defects and remediation and incident review and incident response. So this was one of the fun things. You said a number, 5. The number is 5 decades in professional software development. When I started, so this is a there and back again thing. When I started, the assumption was that computers were expensive and programmers were cheap. And so we would do everything necessary to optimize for the computer's efficient operation, even if that meant that we cost a bunch of time for programmers. And that was true until the microprocessor dropped. When the microprocessor dropped, it was really clear. The cracks had been showing with the mini computer, but when the microprocessor dropped, then it was $10 or $50 for the computer, and more computer time was the negligible cost of electricity. But the programmer's time had become more and more valuable. So everything had to shift. There was this hidden assumption underneath all of the tooling that we worked with that computers were expensive and programmers were cheap. So we had to switch that all on its head. And now we're in a new world, the what's old is new again, where sometimes at some scales, the computers are expensive again and the programmers are relatively cheap. So if you're operating 100,000 servers, the cost of the servers dwarfs whatever the programmer's cost would be, unfortunately. And so again, we're willing to use tools that invest programmer time to make computer time more efficient. But it's not always, and it's sometimes, and there's this whole the changing cost of delay plays into this, and the trajectory of scale plays into it. But it's no longer. So you asked me about cost of ownership, and then I went off someplace. So I'll try and tie it back to what you asked, which is sometimes the cost of the computers, is basically fancy electricity. And that fancy electricity is a significant cost compared to the rest of the costs that we're dealing with. So now we're in this world where sometimes we have to pay attention to computer costs and sometimes we don't.
I feel like that makes a really interesting challenge for organizations to figure out where they should be focusing on one or the other or both at the same time and trying to weigh that up.
If it was easy, this is one of my coaching mottos, if it was easy, regular people could do it.
I'm out of curiosity, if you go back 40, 50 years ago when, let's say, when the perception was that computing cost was higher. I think in the current era, I'm just thinking about AI and some of the arguments against it. People tend to talk about like electricity consumption as being a thing. Was there ever conversations like 30, 40, 50 years ago in the culture like this? All these computers are going to take away all of our resources, our electrical resources that we have limited supply of. Was that part of the narrative back then at all? I just out of curiosity.
Yeah, no, it really wasn't. It wasn't until I saw a Google paper probably around 2000 that talked about, okay, the hardware cost for a server is $3,000 and we're going to spend $3,000 on electricity to run it over its expected lifetime. And I went, what? Like, I'd never thought about it in those terms before. I'm sure other people were thinking about it, but then the whole exponential growth, which is really hard for human brains to wrap their heads around, the fact that it could have, or will have at the current rate, will have serious repercussions for the climate. Nobody was talking about that. Physicists were talking about it. I interned at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, and I remember one of the executives came and talked to us about how solar is really the only sustainable source of electricity because we can't be generating more heat than radiates out into space, or the planet is going to get hotter. But that was a physicist's perspective, not a computer scientist at that point.
You mentioned your book, Tidy First, and one of the things I find interesting about it is that you have a question mark in it. And why not?
Yeah, don't ever do that, by the way. Never put punctuation in the title of a book, because you end up saying, have you read, quote, Tidy First, question mark, quote, question mark. And it just
funny.
Looks stupid.
Was there any other technical weird things you've encountered with putting weird characters or anything in your...
No. That's it. It's just that kind of strange punctuation that you look at, and somebody's eye's going to catch on that in not helpful ways.
So why the question mark?
Oh, because it's a serious question. We have this dilemma as programmers every day, 20 times. We're like, I have to change this function. It's a mess. Should I tidy first? And that puts us in a trade-off space where you have the cost of tidying versus the cost of not tidying, and we have to decide. So the TLDR for the book is the answer to the question is probably, but not too much. Once you start tidying, it gets, then you see, oh, and these names could be improved. Oh, and those names could be improved. And oh, that leads me into this morass here that really ought to be cleaned up. And you end up trying, back to your first question, trying to add to optionality in ways that just don't matter and stalling feature development. So resolving that tension, that's what professional programming is about.
Hey listeners, it's Robby here. It wasn't all that long ago I'd find myself debugging a weird issue in one of our clients' Rails app. I log into one platform to track down the error, only to realize it was tied to some performance issue. And guess what? That meant hopping over into a completely different tool and trying to match things up based off of timestamps, if I was lucky. And let me tell you, my productivity didn't exactly thank me for that. Enter AppSignal, our podcast sponsor, and the tool that eliminates all that back and forth. They bring error tracking, performance monitoring, host metrics, custom metrics, uptime monitoring, and logging into one seamless platform. It's a single source of truth that helps keep your app running like a well-rehearsed symphony. Whether you're working with Ruby, Elixir, Node, Python, or tracking front-end errors in JavaScript, AppSignal has your back. They're always adding support for more languages and frameworks too. And here's the best part. AppSignal won't break the bank. Plans start at just $23 US a month. Plus, they're ISO 27001 certified and fully GDPR and HIPAA compliant, so your data is safe. Oh, and because you're a loyal Maintainable listener, you can use the promo code Maintainable at checkout for 10% off your first year. So head over to appsignal.com. Tell them that your good friend Robby from Maintainable sent you and start making your app sing. That makes sense. And, speaking to that point earlier around optionality in the future, how do you kind of thread that needle between what people might perceive as being like premature optimization for a future that you may not need necessarily. Like, well, if I make this as flexible, maybe I'm using the wrong word there, but as flexible as possible for the software so that we can do more with it later.
That's exactly optionality. You get it.
Where is that line for like when people need to decide, like living with that, say, tension of like, okay, we've done it, we've done enough for now so we can move on. Because I think everybody, that feels like it kind of feels a little subjective. Like,
of course, it's subjective. The information necessary to know whether you need a particular kind of speculative flexibility or not simply doesn't exist at the moment that it first enters your mind. And so the people that I respect the most have a tendency to leave that flexibility in their bag until just before they're going to need it. And they have this seemingly magical sense to go, let's just clean up here a little bit and clean. And then the next day somebody says, well, could you implement blah? And you're like, yeah, that's easy. Where it wouldn't have been easy the day before. And so if you think about every piece of flexibility you put in is an investment and it needs to pay off. Just in human time terms and money terms, whatever, I don't care. Now I'm holding my hands up on an audio only podcast, so I'm going to leave it to you to figure out how to describe this. So we got this investment that we need to make in flexibility, and very early in the process, we can imagine, I need a configuration file with a YAML with a blah 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 blah. And here in the future is the moment when that's going to come in perfectly handy. So at that moment that we imagine it, the payoff moment might be 3 years out. It might be 1 year out. It might be tomorrow. We don't know. But what we do know is the closer we can move that investment to the payoff point, the more economic value we create. And that's just net present value, time value of money. If we can defer an investment that's not going to pay off, then we should defer it. So as a junior programmer, you don't even know what kind of flexibility is you want. As a senior programmer, you're like, okay, I've been in this 5 years. I recognize this situation. I'm going to need blah. To which I say, maybe not. As a junior, senior, wizened, I don't know what's the right word. Somebody's been through the wars. What you realize is, I could put that piece of flexibility in today, but I could also put 100 other pieces of flexibility in today. And the more experience you get, the longer that list gets, to the point that your software is perfectly prepared, except you didn't implement any features, and so the project's canceled. That's what I want to avoid. So I want to leave these investments in my pocket. I want to recognize, someday I'm going to need a config file. Great. I know how to do that. Am I not going to be able to do that? No, I know how this goes. And that's part of the skill of design, is leaving these ideas in your pocket for a while. I'm going to let it drift. And then I have a sense, I have judgment that says, okay, now's the time. That's that tidy first moment. Here's this feature that I need, and it would be really easy to implement if I had a config file. So I'm going to tidy first. I'm going to move whatever the current functionality is into a config file, but not too much. I mean, once I start with the config file, I probably imagine that I've got 20 other things that could go in there too. That's part of the beauty/danger of config files. But I'm going to move just enough so that I'm able to implement my next feature in that easy way. So another phrase I came up with in coaching was, when confronted with a hard change, make the change easy, warning, that may be hard, and then make the easy change. So software development at its highest, from my perspective, is a series of easy, obvious changes that you work extremely hard to make easy and obvious.
I think that's an interesting thing to get to gain the experience and, say, wisdom to know when to pull out those things out of your pocket, those options and tidying tricks or whatever, things that are going to help make your life as a software developer easier to make changes in the future. I think a lot of people will be like, well, make the hard change easy. I think sometimes it's hard for them to wrap their mind around, like the whole thing feels like one big change to make the end result change. So they're like, well, I can't make an easy change out of this because the whole thing seems like a hard thing. So is there ever really an easy change to be made here when it is, you have to go through the hard part to get to the easy part, and they can't distinguish the two?
Yeah, but we've all been through those moments where the code is just perfectly placed for this wild new feature. You know, you're talking to the salesperson like, well, if only it did blah blah blah, then, and you're like, actually, that's easy. Now, usually it's the reverse. So we've experienced code that's easy to change even in unpredictable ways. So it's not like this is a novel experience. Okay, so I have another graphic for you, which you're the host. You'll figure out how to do this. So I wanted to understand. There's this asymptote that you hit where features are easy to add, easy, harder, nearly impossible, right? You hit this asymptote where it's really difficult. So I wanted to understand that. And so here's a graph where we have features are on one axis and options are on the other axis. All right, so now we have options and features. And the natural tendency, you start with a bunch of options and no features. Yeah, so we start up there. The usual tendency is that we implement a feature, so we make progress on the feature axis, but we lose some optionality, even if it's now the build time is a little bit longer, or we have to maintain backwards compatibility or something like that. And the natural tendency, because features are so legible, is that now we implement the next feature and we lose a little more optionality, and the next feature, and we get down to zero options. Now, the reason I noticed this to need to graph it this way is the Genie goes right down to zero. The coding with the augmented coding with an LLM. It goes right down to zero. And then typically we add a little option, just barely enough optionality, and you're in this feature saw down at the bottom.
For our listeners, like there's a little kind of like little saw down there, or a little mountain range, I suppose, of as you add more optionality, it gives you some flexibility to introduce some more features to your system.
So that's kind of the natural tendency, where when you say maintainable software, that's the opposite, right? We only have, and that, I guess that's the ultimate tidy first, where we can't change anything. We have to add this feature or else. So we make it barely possible to add the feature. It feels bad. It's bad economics. It's bad service to our customers. It destroys pride. Like, there's nothing good about living down there. So the alternative. The first step is going to be the same as the first step. You implement a feature, you're going to burn some options. But then you have this space between features, and you can choose to restore and maybe even increase the optionality. And in that little segment there, notice we haven't made any feature progress. We've just restored optionality. We've pulled out helper functions. We've rationalized naming schemes. We've documented. We've made more tests, whatever it is. And now we're ready for the next feature, which is again going to burn options. And then then there's this gap between the features where we introduce more optionality. And then, so that's the trajectory that I'm trying to create.
Now, I think that the thing that about that, and I can see so like, let's just say like people listening are part of an engineering team, and maybe they're following like some sort of sprint-based process, and they might be a couple weeks at a time, and they're like, all right, well, they're expected to be adding new features, or there's this period of there's like the next sprint, we're going to do some tidying and provide more optionality to our system, and the product owners are like, well, we're not shipping any new features. So some tendencies might be to like, well, let's split off some people that are just focused on tidying or refactoring or platform work or whatever, so that the feature team can just keep pushing out features or what have you, making updates to feature while there's someone else keeping things clean. Or there's a lot of different ways that teams have tried to figure out ways to allow some work to be done, dealing with I'm air quoting, the backlog, technical debt backlog, or we haven't even got into that conversation yet. But so it's just, I think that's an interesting thing. Like, and I see you shaking your head there, like that maybe that doesn't quite work. What are you proposing here? just being more.
I'm proposing first that we recognize that 100% utilization is a terrible idea. And this goes back to queuing theory and the Kingman formula, which tells you that as utilization approaches 100%, the wait time for new work in the system approaches infinity. It's not just a little bit worse. It approaches infinity. So the first thing I want to do, if I'm managing a team, the team never gets to sign up for more than half of what they think they can accomplish in a time period.
So what does that then look like then? 50, 60%?
50. No. See, and already you're you're hedging.
I know.
Could it be 60? How about 62? 62.357. Yeah, no. 50%, half. If you think you're signing up for more than half of what you actually think you can accomplish, then you're already screwed. You just don't know how.
So I'm only asking this, dude. I'm not, maybe play a little bit of devil's advocate here. I'm not a product owner. I'm not a product scrum master. I'm none of these things that are responsible for that. I oversee an engineering team. We do client work. We're a consulting space. So we come into spaces and I see all these different flavors or how teams trying to structure things. And we sometimes have to adapt to their environments and share our experiences with them. And the thing that we often get pulled in for is to like, okay, well, the team is busy focused on these things. And can you come in for a period of time and just help us improve X, Y, or Z for a bit? And then you can kind of sneak away. And I'm like, well, we can only do that if we can go in and work with some of your team members and help them build up the skill sets so that they can continue doing that work. Otherwise, you're going to have to call us back again, and then we don't feel like we really did our job outside of maybe fixing a fire for you. And like that's not sustainable for you either. And those developers probably want to pick up those skills as well, and they don't want to feel reliant on some external person to come in. So having said that, we still get deployed in these situations. And so when that happens, I'm always surprised by like, well, there's always this perception like, well, we're only allocating, I'm saying like 80% of the time is like they're working on stuff and then they have 20% to do what they want. Like, it's like, I feel like there's a little bit of I think from the business, I'm air quoting business side of things, like we're already giving them time. What are they doing with that time? And so it's like, well, if we gave them 30% more time, well, what would they be doing? Because it doesn't seem like there's this other tension of like feeling like the engineering team is not doing a good job of maybe selling why they need to address these things, or this technical debt back. They're just complaining about things in the backlog, yada, yada. And stakeholders are thinking, well, we asked for all these features, but no one ever told us that we were making all these concessions along the way, that now we're in this mess. And so where's the engineer's responsibility for being part of that conversation? So it gets into this weird, messy thing where we come in and we're like, I kind of understand everybody's frustration with the situation. So how would you go into those situations? Maybe not so much as a consultant.
Right. You're bumping along the bottom and they want to get out of that. You're going to have to take 2 of those little vertical jumps for every step forward on features. If you want to get out of that, like nobody likes being somebody called that the feature saw, which I thought, you're riding the feature saw and it's every bit as uncomfortable as it sounds. So you want to get out of it. Having somebody come in is like living with a bunch of messy housemates. The kitchen just piled with crap and ugh. And so you're like, well, bring in a house cleaner. A house cleaner comes in, makes seemingly magical progress, but they leave and a week later, the kitchen's exactly the same as it was before.
Unless they keep coming back and then your roommates or your spouse or whatever, you learn that you need to clean up before the cleaner gets there.
Yeah, or people learn that they just don't need to take any care of the kitchen because it's going to magically be clean on Thursday afternoons. The big part of my concern with the scenario you're talking about is divergence of incentives. If you have somebody who only gets juice when whatever form that takes, money, praise, status, autonomy, whatever form that takes, if they only get juice when they make feature progress and nobody cares about the optionality they burn in the process, then bringing in somebody who only cares about optionality, 1, how do you know you've made any progress? And 2, any progress you make is going to immediately be eaten up. So this has to be a collective responsibility. The kitchen that we're all cooking in has to be a collective responsibility if we want it to be maintainable.
We'll be back with our conversation with Kent in just a moment. Hey, it's me, Robby. I just want to say thank you for listening to the podcast. If you're finding these types of conversations valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers and a writing review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to help spread the word. Can you think of someone you think I should have on the podcast sometime? Maybe yourself? Shoot me an email to Robby with a Y at maintainable.fm. And now let's get back to our interview with Kent Beck. How would you describe the difference between tidying and refactoring? Someone that hasn't read your book yet.
Yeah. So that word refactoring means exactly the right thing, and it's been poisoned by people going, and I don't know about that. Well, you can take responsibility for that if you want to. No, what poisons it is people say, oh, well, I did a bunch of refactoring and I broke a bunch of features. This is not refactoring. Refactoring is a change to the structure without any change to the behavior. So if you change the behavior by introducing a bug or whatever, you didn't refactor per definition. Call it something else. You'll notice that I'm never trying to make progress on both features and structure at the same time.
How does that then play out in that scenario where it's like, well, you've got a team, so there's like some people are making progress on some things and some can be working on tidying, or is everybody, do you feel like a team needs to be all doing that collectively at the same time?
Well, but it's not at the same time. It's alternating. And I think it's fractal. So if you and I are coding together and we code for 30 minutes and we think we got a PR and we just say, you know what, let's just read the code top to bottom one time just to see what we see. That's a tiny little jump in optionality. Whatever we find, whatever knowledge we gain, whatever context we gain by doing that is a little bit of optionality. So sure, that. Or we get to 4 p.m., we finish our feature. You know what really bugged us today was the way this tool kept barfing when blah, 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 blah. We don't want to start a new feature right now. So let's just go fix that little pain point. What it never is we're going to take 6 months and get rid of all the technical debt, because that trick never works. In the famous words of Rocky and Bullwinkle.
I'm curious about, using that scenario there where let's do some tidying before. Do you tend to then treat that as separate unit of work and push that or commit that isolated and then have that be a prerequisite before you dive into the feature thing? Or do you just bundle that together? Because I think some people be like, well, if it's not directly part of the Jira ticket or whatever, it's like outside of scope, and their team culture so far has been, I think maybe that speaks to a different issue, is like if you're making small updates and getting that PR reviewed for that one tidying thing before you start working on the feature, what's that workflow ideally look like? Because I feel like some teams might be feeling a little rigid right now.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of separating structure and behavior changes into separate PRs for reasons. And the reason is that feature changes tend to be irreversible. In the whatever Bezos had, the type 1 and type 2 decisions, or the one-way door versus the two-way door. Feature changes tend to be irreversible. If you change the numbers you report to the IRS and you've screwed it up, unsticking that problem is going to be really expensive. So you need to be careful with features by reviewing tests, reviewing the structure of the code. Review doesn't necessarily mean a blocking post asynchronous review. But anyway, you need careful thought into changes to features because of irreversibility. Most structure changes are reversible. I extract a helper method. You're like, we don't need these tiny little methods. You inline it. Okay, it's reversible. And if you have reversible decisions, you don't have to give them the same level of scrutiny that you do those irreversible decisions. If we're going to change the privacy policy and roll it out to all billion customers, oh yeah, you're going to think really hard about that at every level, the implementation, the specification. You're going to de-risk that which way you can, because it's an irreversible decision with probably with existential consequences if you get it wrong. But if you say, well, this should be its own object, and you make it its own object, and then you tidy the code inside of it, and I don't like it, like I just inline it. Except probably I don't. But maybe we sit down together and I say, well, now I want to make this kind of change, and with this structure, the way you changed it, it makes that change I want to make more difficult. Oh, well, what would the design need to be like so that it was easy to make this change? Make the change easy, then make the easy change. That's a much less fraught conversation. So separate PRs for sure. And if somebody can prove to me some kind of way that there's no chance of behavior change based on this, then I just LGTM.
Do you feel like tidying helps reveal missing intent?
Sure, absolutely. You're refactoring. Oh, and we've got a pushed question on the stack about tidying versus refactoring. It's common to be changing the structure, and you look and you're like, that cannot be. This if statement is just flat out wrong, clearly wrong. Or you have an if statement and the then and the else are exactly the same, for example. And you're like, something's wrong here. Absolutely, the code teaches you something about the domain if you're paying attention.
What do you think are some effective ways that while teams are tidying, they can share what they're learning with each other?
Pairing is the most powerful. Just talk to people. I know we're nerds. I know this is uncomfortable, but we're talking about stuff we actually care about, that we understand. It's actually going to be okay.
What about for our listeners who might be thinking, well, I feel like I don't have the permission to do a lot of tidying?
Well, you probably don't. Why is so I have seen situations bad enough that people are threatened with termination if they keep this refactoring bullshit happening, or if they write tests for their code, they will be terminated, period. My heart goes out to you. That's a very difficult situation. Creating career options is a powerful lever, the most powerful lever you have in that situation. Whether that's going to meetups, making friendships, publishing in some kind of way, if it's that bad. Oftentimes it's more like, kind of the side eye and the squinchy face and the little hurt puppy dog look. And I think closing the loop when the optionality you created does pay off. Like, okay, that was easy, huh? Yeah. You remember the last time we added a widget to this panel? Oh, God, it took us weeks. And now we did it in a half an hour and it was all correct. Whew. Okay. So we added optionality and then we used it.
Whenever I talk with engineers who are concerned about, let's say that non-ideal, I think we could all agree would be a very non-ideal scenario where your team doesn't want you to spend time writing tests. My question is like, well, how do you know it works? You did some testing, I'm assuming. It could be manually copy pasting something into a thing and running a command, what have you. You're testing it, and automating that is a way to make your job a little bit easier. But I think sometimes the framing of like, well, we don't have good test coverage, and so we need to spend months getting this cleaned up is where the conversation kind of dies. And so then the perception by engineers ends up being they don't value testing because they won't invest the time to get us up to speed on this process.
And they've never lived with good tests. So I have a piece called the Test Desiderata. I waited 55 years to use that word desiderata, which is a list of desired properties. I finally used it. And of course, it's a huge mistake because nobody knows what it means. But anyway, it's a list of 12 properties that your tests should have. And sometimes there's trade-offs between the properties, and sometimes there's the possibility of transcending some of the trade-offs. But the highest level is that tests should be inspirational. Your tests should inspire you. They in this kind of optionality sense. We could do anything and it's fine. Just bring it. Bring a hard one. Come on. Something that you think is really going to be difficult and scary. And we're still going to deploy Friday afternoon, and we're still going to have a great time with our kids all weekend.
Do you have strong opinions about deploying on Fridays?
If you can't, you have nothing more important to do than to figure out why you can't fix it. Period.
You should feel comfortable going into the weekend. Everything, there might be issues that pop up on a weekend, but you fix it.
At the same rate that they pop up any other time.
It's not great to disrupt your weekend, yes, but it's also not great to disrupt your workday either. I think people don't protect their ability to focus throughout the normal work schedule. And they're like, well, if we do something and it pops up and it disrupts my plans for the week, and we have to put out a fire, you're still putting out a fire.
Yeah, if you have a fire every day, you're going to have a fire Saturday and Sunday too. Figure out why you're having fires. And address it. Address it at every level. Did we plan for too much, and so we were rushed, and so we didn't have the testing or we didn't have the validation that we needed? Was this just some exogenous change that nobody could have foreseen? Deming has this separation between common cause and special cause variation that's really useful too. Is this just a one-off, or does this happen every Wednesday afternoon? You should treat those two situations completely differently.
I like that framing there. I feel like I saw something else recently, and it's what's the difference between is this a problem or a situation? Might have been in a Seth Godin blog post or something like that. But I thought it was helpful for me to think about when issues might arise in my leadership team. And I'm like, I find myself using them well, okay, is this a recurring thing, or is this just a thing we need to live with? And as time passes, it'll kind of just work itself out in a little bit. We don't have to deal with it. Maybe it's a little different when it gets into software issues where maybe there's an issue in deployment or that's happening in production, or
it's exactly the same structure. If you overreact to special case variation, then you tend to oscillate. If you underreact to common cause variation, those chronic conditions, then you're just going to bump. It's going to cost you over and over again. So that's why you need to make the separation. If this is just something that, again, right, you got a flaky test and this test fails and it's the 40th time it's failed. That's a much higher priority than, oh wow, on a leap year when the test run starts before midnight and after. Yeah, it'd probably be better to address that, but it's not the same level of urgency as a test that fails 30% of the time.
You talk about optionality and also around tidying being an economic decision, not necessarily a moral one. And when you think about trying to, for engineers listening, to try to communicate the value of some of these trade-offs to non-technical leaders.
Wait. I'm going to interrupt you because the premise of the question I already want to react to, which is, I think there is a moral dimension to this. I think we have an ethical obligation to our colleagues not to make work unnecessarily harder. So if I cook in the kitchen, I should clean up in the kitchen because, there is a moral obligation there. If I want to be part of a community and we're all sharing this space, then if I mess it up, I should fix it for the next person, just as a moral obligation, as a way of keeping our social fabric strong. I think it also, tidying needs to align with economics, but not necessarily be driven by economics. I'm not making an ROI statement of you'll make 14.2, basis points better, blah, gross margin because blah. Nah, nobody can measure that. We're talking about optionality. And it's hard enough, if you've ever studied options pricing, it's hard enough to predict option prices when all of the parameters are really regular and set and observable. You and I decide to extract the helper method. How much money have we saved or earned? That's just the wrong way to think about it. It is a useful way to think about it, that I have the same ethical obligation to you as you have to me. If we're going to work together and be two human beings in a relationship around this shared purpose that we don't make each other's jobs unnecessarily harder.
I appreciate it. Thanks for clarifying that. So where I was trying to go with that, I was like thinking around like, how do you convey the value of needing to make some of these trade-offs to, say, I'm air quoting, non-technical, I wish there was a better, the other people that are not writing software for day in and day out and have some control over the direction or priorities coming up for your engineering team. Like, have you found that there's certain metaphors or stories that tend to make some of these ideas click a bit better?
Yes, absolutely. The kitchen is a great one. Everybody's experienced it. Everybody's come into a kitchen to a sink full of dirty dishes and gone, I really want to make a grilled cheese sandwich, but it's going to be too much of a pain to wash the pan so never mind. I think the same like that features versus options, that's also been very helpful. It sounds, the story as told by most geeks just sounds absurd. We have technical debt and we need to stop feature development to clean it up. And so one, why'd you screw it up in the first place? What? And two, stop feature development. Okay, at the end of the 3 months, I'm going to have exactly what I have today. No, we're not going to do that. And you might have jumping up and down, and yes, we absolutely have to do this, or we can't implement any more features. But, put the investor hat on, take your programmer hat off, put the investor hat on, and try that story out. And it just makes absolutely no sense.
Like, you wouldn't pay for someone to come in, and you'd still want to be able to cook, right, in your kitchen, right, like pretty quickly, and not need to wait 3 months before you can use the kitchen again.
Right, which is why slicing and sequencing is a critical design skill that we don't talk about. That I call that succession. What is the sequence of structure changes that'll result in the structure that we want to get to? And there's always some sequence. And every time I've thought, oh no, this is really atomic and indivisible, I've later on regretted it and figured out how to make the same change in a bunch of slices.
Hey folks, it's Robby here. If your team's got too much on their plate, fixing bugs, shipping features, trying to get through that long overdue upgrade, Planet Argon might be able to help. We offer team augmentation for companies that aren't ready to hire full-time people, but still need to make some progress. We work with teams using Ruby on Rails, Laravel, Vue, Next.js, just to name a few. And here's what we believe. Good software deserves a second act. So if your app is still doing its job, but just needs some cleanup or tidying, some care, and a few extra hands for a while, we'd love to help you tidy. Visit planetargon.com. Again, that's planetargon.com. All right, let's get back to the conversation with Kent Beck. I don't get the sense that you advocate for just throwing a bunch of things into a backlog and then assigning them here and there, or where's that line between you like, we should put everything into, let's say, a Jira ticket or whatever system you're using as a project manager, maybe reframing things and not calling something technical debt, but like, these are things we need to clean up, or is it, and maybe this gets a little bit into the when you do these things as well. So it's like, can I do this right now, or should we do this later, or should we just never do this? And what's kind of like obviously we'll send people to go pick up the copy of the book and stuff like that, but what's kind of like the short TLDR on that?
You have a community. So part of the problem here is that we have two views of the same system. One view of the same system says, I have an idea and I implement a feature, and then I have another idea and I implement a feature, and then I have an idea and I implement a feature, and we just go around and around and around. That's all that they see. So that's the product view, or the salesperson view, or the user's view. They see some new feature. Okay, here it is. And that's not the reality that you and I as programmers live with. The structure matters tremendously. If I've got some function that's 500 lines long with 60 local variables and what else, like, I just see that and I run screaming. Actually, I don't, but because I have little things I can do to help with that. Tidying, they're cute, fuzzy little refactorings. But, nobody wants to run into that function. But the person who's looking up from above the surface is like the swan. The swan's gliding along, and then below, the feet are paddling and poop's coming out. And, it's a completely different experience above the water, below the water. And that's a big part of the problem. And we as programmers haven't done a very good job of explaining, hey, the stuff below the water, I know you can't see that. You don't experience it day to day directly. You see that our feature velocity is going down. You see the defects are going up. You see that customer satisfaction is going down. That's all the long-term consequence of not making any investments below the surface. Okay. But direct experience, somebody above the water never sees that function and has PTSD. Never has the panic attack. Breathing stays normal. They just don't see it. And as programmers, it's our responsibility to communicate like this, features and options, like I understand about net present value. I understand about options pricing. I've learned about that. I understand about ergodicity, the idea, people want to make the design perfect before they start, which means that the whole project is less likely to survive infancy. And so that's a bad trade-off. Much as I hate to say it, because I'd like everything to be clean and tidy and perfect at all times, I just have to recognize you gotta make the knife dirty before you can wipe it. You gotta cut something.
We only have so much time with you today, Kent, and a couple of last questions I'd love to get your take on. One, for our listeners in particular, I was thinking, again, I'm encouraging them all to go pick up a copy of the book and read it, and we can have a book club about this. But if there's one small habit you'd recommend today that would help an individual start making some progress on, say, the maintainability of their software, and maybe they felt like their peers haven't cared about it as much as they do, but they've advocated for making some improvements, but they've heard not right now, maybe another time, a few too many times, and so they've stopped asking. What could they start doing now?
Make smaller changes and start doing it. The simplest tidying in the world is adding a blank line to a big, long, monolithic function. Oh, you're reading the function. You're like, what's going on? And you read and you read and you read and you go, I see this first part munges the thing and the second part computes based on the munged thing. Oh, put in a blank line between the two parts.
You're blowing my mind right now. That's so simple. I don't think, it's such an interesting thing. I don't feel like I've heard enough people talk about the value and the benefit of just a really useful blank line. It's like you see it, you feel it, but I don't know that I don't think I see like a lot of PRs. Maybe that's just the unfortunate that the teams that I work with tend to embrace a good blank line here and there. But when do you think it's important to add in some code comments into those right above them?
Same. Oh, now you're talking about big changes. Relatively big changes. You read, and you come to some realization. Oh, when this collection's empty, that means blah. Okay, that's a good comment to put in for now. There's another tidying which says, you know what, the code reads so easily by itself that this comment is completely redundant. So there's another tidying which says, okay, if there's a redundant comment, delete it. But you're going to have to work hard to make the code talk that effectively, I published 2 books on the topic.
And I will include links to them all for our listeners as well.
Okay, super, thanks.
So Kent, a couple of last quick questions for you. Is there a non-software, non-technical book that you find yourself recommending to peers?
Yeah, The Timeless Way of Building by Christopher Alexander. It's all in there.
Look that up. I have not heard of that one. Also include that for everybody in our show notes. And where can listeners best follow your thoughts and ruminations about software engineering online? Your Substack?
Tidyfirst.substack.com.
Excellent. Again, links in the show notes for everybody. And with that, Kent, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop with us today.
Oh, Robby, thank you so much.
You've been listening to Maintainable, a Planet Argon production. Editing by Claudia Armbruster. Post-production by Auden Morgan and Ellis Fenson. Emotional support from the letter M. for Maintainable, for momentum, for making things better. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Keep showing up. See you next time. Maintainable.